In the summer of 1944, somewhere in the bocage country of Normandy, a Sherman tank crew from the 2nd Armored Division encountered a German Panther for the first time. The Panther weighed 45 tons. Its front armor was angled at 35 degrees and thick enough to stop almost anything the Americans could throw at it. Its 75-millimeter gun could penetrate a Sherman from nearly a mile away. The Sherman weighed 33 tons. Its armor was vertical, which meant thinner protection for the same weight. Its 75-millimeter gun could not reliably penetrate the Panther's front plate at any combat range. The American crew knew this. Every tank crew in Normandy knew this by the end of the first week of fighting. They had learned it the hard way in burning fields and shattered orchards, watching friends die in vehicles that caught fire so reliably that German soldiers had given the Sherman a nickname. They called it the Tommy Cooker. The British called it the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan was that it lit first time, every time. The crew of that Sherman in the bocage did not have better armor. They did not have a better gun. What they had was a radio that worked, a commander who had been trained to think fast, and 3 more Shermans within calling distance. They flanked the Panther. They hit it from the side where the armor was thinner. They killed it. That engagement, repeated thousands of times across Western Europe in 1944 and 45, is the answer to one of the most debated questions in the history of the Second World War. Why did American tanks win when German tanks were objectively superior in almost every technical category that tank designers care about? The answer is not simple. It is not flattering to everyone involved. And it contains lessons about war and industry and the difference between winning individual battles and winning wars that are as relevant today as they were 80 years ago in the burning fields of France. Start with the honest assessment, because the honest assessment is where the interesting story begins. The Sherman tank was not a bad tank. That point needs to be made clearly before anything else, because the Sherman has acquired a reputation in popular history that is somewhat worse than the evidence supports. It was reliable. It was mechanically simple enough that crews could repair it in the field with tools they actually had. It was fast, faster than the Panther in many conditions, and its turret traversed quickly enough to matter in close combat. It was produced in numbers that stagger the imagination when you sit down with the production statistics. But against the best German armor, the Sherman was outclassed. Not marginally outclassed, significantly outclassed in the categories that determine survival in tank versus tank combat. The Panther's front armor could not be penetrated by the standard Sherman's gun at normal combat ranges. The Tiger's armor was even more formidable. American tankers went into battle knowing that they were driving vehicles their opponents could kill at distances where they could not effectively respond. The casualty rates reflected this. In Normandy, American armored units lost tanks at ratios that would have been considered catastrophic in almost any other military context. Some analysts have estimated that it took 4 or 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Panther in direct combat, when accounting for all engagements rather than cherry-picking favorable ones. The men inside those 4 or 5 Shermans were not abstractions. They were 20-year-olds from Ohio and Georgia and California who had been told they were going to liberate Europe and had not been told quite how expensive the process would be. So why did the Americans build the Sherman instead of something better? The answer to that question requires going back to 1941 and understanding a set of decisions that made complete sense at the time and look different in retrospect. In 1941, American military planners were designing a tank force to fight a war they had not yet entered against an enemy they understood imperfectly. The lessons available to them came primarily from the German campaigns in Poland and France, where German armor had performed brilliantly, but where the engagements had been characterized by rapid movement and exploitation rather than the kind of grinding tank versus tank attrition that would define the fighting in Normandy and beyond. The planners concluded, not unreasonably given the available evidence, that the primary role of the tank was exploitation and infantry support rather than direct combat against enemy armor. Anti-tank guns would handle enemy tanks. Tanks would handle everything else. This doctrinal assumption shaped the design specifications for the Sherman, which was optimized for reliability, producibility, and the ability to support infantry rather than for defeating the heaviest German armor. The assumption was wrong. Not completely wrong, because tanks spent far more time supporting infantry than fighting other tanks even in 1944, but wrong enough to matter in the moments that cost lives. The production decision compounded the design decision. By the time American planners recognized that heavier German tanks were appearing in significant numbers, the Sherman production line was running at a scale that changing course would have disrupted severely. The M26 Pershing, a tank genuinely capable of engaging Panthers and Tigers on roughly equal terms, existed by 1943. It did not reach Europe in significant numbers until early 1945, 2 years after its development was complete, because the logistics of replacing an established production run with a new design were more complicated than the tactical argument for doing so. General Leslie McNair, who commanded Army ground forces and whose influence on American tank doctrine was enormous, held firm to the position that tanks should not fight tanks until the evidence had become too expensive to ignore. McNair died in Normandy in July of 1944, killed by American bombs in a friendly fire incident before he had to fully reckon with what his doctrine had cost. The men who paid the price for these decisions were not generals. They were sergeants and privates and corporals who climbed into Shermans every morning knowing the technical reality of their situation and did it anyway, which deserves to be acknowledged before the analysis continues. Now here is where the story changes. Because the technical inferiority of the Sherman tank is only half the picture, and the half that gets talked about the least is the half that actually determined the outcome of the war. Germany produced approximately 8,400 Panther tanks during the entire war. That number represents an extraordinary industrial achievement given the bombing campaign that the Allies were conducting against German production facilities throughout this period. The Panther was a complex, technically sophisticated vehicle that required skilled labor and precision manufacturing at every stage of its assembly. The United States produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks, not over the entire war, not at peak production, over the period from 1942 to 1945. 49,000 versus 8,400. The ratio is approximately 6-to-1 in favor of American production, and that ratio does not include Soviet production of the T-34, which added tens of thousands of additional armored vehicles to the Allied side of the ledger, nor British production of their own tank designs. Germany was fighting a war of quality against enemies with the industrial capacity to make quality irrelevant through quantity. And Germany understood this. German planners understood it as early as 1942. They understood it clearly by 1943. Understanding it and doing anything about it were different problems, because the industrial decisions that would have been required to shift production towards simpler, more numerous vehicles would have required accepting short-term vulnerability while long-term capacity was rebuilt, and Germany's strategic situation from 1942 onward never offered the breathing room that kind of industrial transition required. But the production numbers, compelling as they are, still do not fully explain the American advantage. The Soviet Union had enormous production capacity and produced tanks in vast numbers, but Soviet tank tactics in the early years of the war produced casualties that even the industrial logic of quantity could barely sustain. Production capacity is necessary. It is not sufficient. What the Americans brought to the equation, in addition to production capacity, was a logistical system that no other army in the war matched. Not Germany, not Britain, not the Soviet Union. Consider what it means to keep an armored formation in the field during sustained combat operations. A Sherman tank consumed approximately 50 gallons of fuel for every 100 miles of travel. It required regular maintenance that, if deferred, produced mechanical failures at rates that degraded unit effectiveness faster than combat losses. When it was damaged in battle, it required either repair parts delivered to the front or evacuation to a rear workshop, and both options required a logistics chain capable of moving heavy equipment and specialized supplies to the right place at the right time. The American logistics system in Western Europe was the most sophisticated military supply operation in history to that point. The Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that moved supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front lines, operated at a scale that German planners found difficult to fully comprehend. American armored divisions could advance faster than German logistics officers believed was sustainably possible because American supply columns were moving behind them at speeds that German horse-drawn transport simply could not match. A Panther that ran out of fuel was worth nothing. A Panther whose crew was exhausted because replacement parts had not arrived was worth nothing. A Tiger whose engine had seized because the maintenance schedule had slipped due to supply problems was worth nothing. German after-action reports from the Normandy campaign and the subsequent pursuit across France contain repeated references to vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel, formations unable to counterattack because ammunition had not arrived, maintenance backlogs that reduced unit strength by 30 or 40% before the first shot was fired. The Americans lost more tanks in individual engagements. The Germans lost more tanks to logistics failures, mechanical breakdowns, and the inability to replace losses at the rate the campaign demanded. There is a specific engagement that illustrates this dynamic with unusual clarity. In August of 1944, during the American breakout from Normandy known as Operation Cobra, the 4th Armored Division advanced approximately 400 miles in less than 3 weeks. This was not primarily a tank versus tank achievement. It was a logistics achievement. The division's Shermans kept moving because fuel kept arriving, because maintenance crews kept vehicles operational, because the command structure had been designed to enable rapid decision-making at the level where rapid decisions were needed. The German formations attempting to respond to this advance were not inferior in tactical skill. German officers who had survived 4 years of war on the Eastern Front knew how to conduct armored operations. What they did not have was the logistical infrastructure to concentrate their remaining armor at the point where it could have stopped the American advance before it became irreversible. By the time they assembled sufficient force, the opportunity had passed. George Patton, who commanded the Third Army during this period, understood the relationship between logistics and operational tempo better than almost anyone on either side. His famous statement that an army marches on its stomach was not original to him, but his application of it was. He pushed his supply officers as hard as he pushed his combat commanders because he understood that the supply officers were the ones who made the combat commanders' ambitions possible. Now set the logistics question aside for a moment and look at the tactical level. because there is a third element to this story that gets less attention than either production numbers or logistics. American combined arms tactics by 1944 were genuinely superior to what the Americans had been doing in 1942. This sounds obvious, but the process by which it happened was neither automatic nor painless. The American army that landed in North Africa in November of 1942 was, by any honest assessment, not ready for what it encountered. The defeat at Kasserine Pass in February of 1943 was a serious setback that exposed doctrinal weaknesses, training deficiencies, and command failures that the Army had to address quickly or risk losing the campaign. The response to Kasserine was one of the more impressive institutional self-corrections in military history. Commanders who had failed were replaced, not always fairly, but quickly. Tactical doctrine was revised based on what the fighting had actually shown, rather than what pre-war theory had predicted. Training programs were updated. The lessons learned in North Africa were distributed to formations that had not yet been in combat, so that the price of education paid in Tunisia would not have to be paid again in Sicily and Italy and France. By June of 1944, the American armored doctrine that landed at Normandy was substantially better than the doctrine that had gone ashore at Casablanca 18 months earlier. Tank crews had learned to work with infantry. Infantry had learned to work with tanks. Artillery coordination had improved to the point where it was becoming the primary tool for destroying German armor rather than direct tank fire. Tank destroyers, the doctrinal answer to the tank versus tank problem that McNair had insisted upon, were being used effectively in roles their designers had not fully anticipated. The most important tactical lesson American tankers learned in 1943 and applied in 1944 was the one that opened this story. Never fight a Panther or a Tiger from the front if there is any alternative. The frontal armor could not be defeated by the standard Sherman's gun at normal combat ranges. The side and rear armor could. Tactics that accepted higher short-term risk in order to achieve flank or rear shots were more effective than direct frontal engagements, and American crews who understood this and acted on it survived at higher rates than those who did not. This tactical adaptation was not written in a manual somewhere and distributed from above. It emerged from the experience of crews who had survived engagements and thought carefully about what had kept them alive, and then talked to other crews, and then saw their conclusions validated or refuted in subsequent engagements. The American Army in 1944 was a learning organization in a way that its German opponent, increasingly rigid under the pressure of Hitler's interference in tactical decisions and the depletion of its experienced officer corps, was not. There is one more element to this story that deserves direct acknowledgement, because it sits underneath everything else and is sometimes ignored because it is uncomfortable. Germany was fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously by 1944. The Eastern Front consumed the majority of German armor, the majority of German air power, and the majority of German military manpower throughout the war. The divisions that American forces encountered in France were not the full expression of German military capability. They were what remained after the Eastern Front had taken its share, which was the larger share by a significant margin. The best German armor, the most experienced German tank crews, the majority of German Panther production, were deployed against the Soviet Union. American forces in Normandy faced German formations that were real and dangerous and capable of inflicting the casualties that they inflicted. They also faced German formations that were under strength, undersupplied, and fighting without the air cover and logistical support that would have made them significantly more formidable. The Soviets paid an extraordinary price to make the American campaign in Western Europe more manageable than it would otherwise have been. Soviet tank losses in the war exceeded any figure that American production would have been able to sustain. Soviet infantry casualties were on a scale that American society, with its different relationship to acceptable losses, could not have politically absorbed. The Eastern Front was not a sideshow to the American experience of the war. It was the context that made the American experience possible. American tanks were inferior to German tanks. That is a technical fact. American tankers died in numbers that reflected that technical fact. The men who died deserve to be remembered accurately, which means acknowledging both their courage and the equipment failures that made their courage necessary. But the war was not decided by which tank could defeat which other tank in a direct engagement. It was decided by which side could produce more, sustain more, adapt faster, and coordinate across a coalition of allies with different capabilities and different interests. On every one of those measures, the Allied side was superior, and the Sherman tank, unremarkable in a one-on-one engagement against a Panther, was a critical component of the system that delivered that superiority. The German tanker who climbed into a Panther in 1944 was climbing into the finest tank available in that war by most technical measures. He was also climbing into a vehicle that his country could not produce fast enough, could not fuel reliably enough, and could not replace quickly enough to change the outcome that production mathematics had already determined. The American tanker who climbed into a Sherman knew he was at a disadvantage in a direct engagement with the best German armor. He climbed in anyway. And then he radioed his position, called for artillery support, coordinated with the infantry on his left, and used the logistics system behind him to ensure that his tank would be fueled, maintained, and replaced if necessary. That is why the Sherman won. Not because it was a better tank, because it was part of a better system. And in wars between industrial powers fighting across entire continents, the system is what wins. If this analysis changed how you think about American armor in the Second World War, please like and subscribe. We examine the systems and decisions behind the battles, the numbers behind the legends, and the full picture behind the stories that history tends to simplify. Thank you for watching.